Redux is undeniably one of the most well-known and widely used state management libraries. There was a time when it was so heavily used it felt like a symbiotic, inseparable part of React and React Native. And even though we are far past Redux monopoly days, it still is a super relevant tool, and the fact that many of you asked me to do a tutorial on how to test it just proves its relevance to this day. So, in response to the popular outcry, today's tutorial is testing Redux and React Native with testing library. The first important thing for us to know is what's going to change between testing a regular React Native application and a Redux one. The answer to that is almost nothing. One of testing library's first and main philosophies is that you should test your application like a user interacting with it. By doing so, your tests not only become much clearer, but you don't have to worry about implementation details, such as how your code is structured, which part of your code contains which functionality, knowing that refactor your code will break most of your tests, and so on. But even though the way you test your code is the same, the way you render it isn't. If you're familiar with testing library, you know that the first step necessary to test a component is rendering it. And if you're also familiar with Redux, you know that any component that uses data stored in Redux must be wrapped inside a provider, a fancy word for the thing that wraps your code, which consumes a store, a fancy word for your data. The catch is, usually when testing a component, we are only telling testing library to render it. But if that component relies on Redux for its state management, it also expects a provider with a store wrapping that component. Hence, when we try to render that component, we will have an error thrown at our face. The solution to this problem is as basic as it seems. Whenever you are testing a Redux component, just render it with a provider around it. To avoid repeating the same Redux rendering logic all over our codebase, we can use Jest globals. Jest is a test runner shipped by default in React Native projects, and globals are globally available utility functions. Although a default one for rendering Redux components doesn't exist, we can create it and expose it globally throughout our code. In order to teach you how to do this, we are going to test a basic Redux application. I already created it, so we can only focus on what's essential for us today, testing the application, not creating it. The app is as simple as it gets. It's just a counter. You can increment or decrement your count, and also you can change the amount of units added or subtracted at a time. Start by cloning the project. You can find the link to it in the description. Then proceed to install its dependencies. Although the project is fully functional and already works with Redux, the testing environment is the default one provided by React Native CLI when you create a new project. So, the first step we'll take is installing testing library in our project. You can do it by opening a terminal in your projects folder and typing npm install savedev add testing library/React Native. Or you can do it by using yarn by simply replacing the npm install command with yarn add and by also replacing savedev with /D. Make sure to copy the command exactly as it is written in the screen right now. Quoting its own documentation, the React Native testing library is a lightweight solution for testing React Native components. It provides light utility functions on top of React Test Renderer in a way that encourages better testing practices. You can learn more about it by reading the library's documentation and by watching a video I made about it a while ago. I'll link both resources in the video's description so you can take a look at them later. With testing library installed, we are ready to start testing our application. Inside the tests folder, delete the app test.js file and proceed to create a new folder called pages with a file called counter.spec.js inside of it. That file will contain our application's integration tests. Open the counter.spec file and write a describe function with a description of what is going to be tested inside of it, the counter page. Inside our describe, let's create a test block with the keyword it to create a test block. If this part sounds confusing to you, make sure to refer to Jest documentation on globals or to my first video about tests with React Native. In our first test, let's assert that our component renders correctly. Import render from testing library and the counter component from pages/counter. Just render your component by calling the render function with the tested component as a parameter. Then proceed to test it using either yarn test or npm run test. And you should see the following error. Could not find React Redux context value. Please ensure the component is wrapped in a provider. That's the expected behavior. Remember when I explained why this happened and how to solve it a few moments ago? In order to fix this, we must wrap our rendered component in a provider. Import provider from React Redux and store from our local folder Redux. Wrap the tested component inside the provider and pass our store as a prop to it. Now, let's run our tests again, and they work perfectly. But we can all agree that's an overly verbose and not reusable solution. So let's create a function that handles rendering Redux components for us. Start by declaring a function called renderWithRedux, which expects a rendered component as an argument. In the first line of that function, create a store that includes all of your reducers. Since I'm using Redux Toolkit in this project, I'm going to create my store using the configure store method. But this is not mandatory. You can create your store using any strategy you prefer, as long as you get a valid Redux store at the end of it. Creating a new store every time the function is invoked is useful because it ensures that you have a clean state, and therefore that your tests run in isolation. Which is good because ensuring that each test runs in its own clean environment prevents new tests from changing the test environment and breaking pre-existing tests. Once our store creation is done, return React Testing Library's render function with our rendered component wrapped in a provider that receives our recently created store as a prop. And there it is. We have a function for rendering components that use Redux. Let's test it. Replace the content of our test function with our newly created renderWithRedux function and pass our counter component as a parameter to it. Reopen the terminal and run our test suite. Wait for the tests to finish and... Awesome, it works, but currently this is written in our test document and that's not ideal. Let's move this function to its own document and make it globally available in our test suite. At the root of our project, create a folder called helpers, and inside of it, another folder called test helpers. Inside test helpers, create a file called renderWithRedux and move our function there. Make sure to export renderWithRedux so it's accessible from other files. From now on, we could just import this function into our test files and that will do the job. But I want it to become a Jest global, just like it or the scribe, which are accessible inside our tests without the need of importing them. To do this, we will need a Jest setup file, which is where we import useful scripts, configure custom globals, which is our case, and so on. Navigate to your package.json and find the Jest configuration line. Below the configured preset, add a property called setup files. That property's value will be an array containing all of our configuration files. Add the following string to our setup files array's content. This is pointing to a file in our root directory called setuptests.js. That file does not exist yet, so let's create it. In the root of our directory, create a file called setuptests.js. That's the file where we'll make our renderWithRedux helper globally available inside our test suite. To do this, import our function in the document and after that type the following: global.renderWithRedux equals renderWithRedux. Save all the changes you made and get back to our counter test, where we still have a version of renderWithRedux declared. Delete the function declaration from the test document alongside with its dependencies, but leave the function invocation as it is. If we did everything right, our function will be available globally and our tests will be executed with no errors. Let's run our tests to make sure that everything is running as expected. And awesome! It works just like it should. From now on, our tests will be reading like any testing library test, but instead of using the render function made available by testing library, we will be using renderWithRedux. Let's prove this by writing a test. Since this video is about setting up tests with Redux and not testing itself, I'm going to make a real simple test. Let's make sure the initial value of our counter is 0. Inside our counter specs file, create a new test by using the if keyword and describe that the counter page should start with 0 as the current count. Use the renderWithRedux function to render our counter. If you're familiar with testing library, you know whenever we render a component, we get a lot of methods that can be used to query the component we just rendered. In this case, we are going to use the getByText one. Since we want to make sure our counter starts at 0, let's search for the text 0. getByText returns us the queried component, so let's assert that whatever is returned by getByText won't be null. Let's run our test, and there it is, a fully functional Redux test. Well, that wraps up this video, and if you want to learn more about tests and React Native in general, make sure to watch my other videos, subscribe to my channel, and follow me on Twitter. If you like this video, remember to like it. This allows me to reach more people with my content and is an important metric for me to find out which content is liked and disliked by my audience. I really hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed making it, and thanks for watching me. Bye!